looks like we are live. Might as well get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I am the host of Global Dispatches, this very podcast. Constantine, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, Mark. My name is Constantine Manda. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine.
So, Constantine, on November 1st, Tanzania's election commission affirmed the victory of incumbent president Samia Suluhu Hassan, saying that she won 98% of the vote. Now, unfortunately, election rigging, election shenanigans are not terribly uncommon in the region. But at least, in my experience, when results are announced, they're within like the veneer of possibility. But you're talking about 98% of the vote. That's like Saddam Hussein territory. What does this supposed election margin that was recently announced suggest to you about politics in Tanzania today?
It doesn't bring in any new information, really, and the protests were actually planned well in advance of the election date. And so the first kind of misinformation that's still out there is that these are election protests. They're not election protests. They're protests against the ruling party, a party that in many different versions has been ruling Tanzanians since 1961 at independence. Um, every election has planned demonstrations and protests. This is the first time in Tanzania's history where those protests have been widespread and sustained for as long as they have. And obviously, they are, because of that, they are the only demonstrations and protests that have seen the most amounts of deaths and injuries as a result. The 98% is really one of many objects that we can talk about the kind of current state of Tanzanian politics. But the protesters and the actors, including the activists who had been urging people to protest ahead of the election date, were not protesting this particular election. If anything, even if they weren't any violent protests, there was already a protest of low voter turnout. And so the Electoral Commission, beyond claiming a 98% win percentage for the president, they also claiming 87% turnout. This is the highest of any election going all the way back to 1962, which is the first election for the presidency and parliamentary seats in Tanzania, where we had multi-party democracy. 1965 all the way to 1995 was one party rule. So the elections were both mostly a yes or no for the presidency, and a yes or no for two candidates that are running in constituencies. And so 87% turnout is the highest ever recorded, even in an era of one party politics. And they're claiming that Tanzanians have shown out to this election more than they ever have, despite the fact that we have video evidence of ballot boxes being destroyed by the protesters. We have video evidence of polling stations being burnt down before polling concluded. And so this is just a kind of doublespeak Orwellian world that Tanzanians are now forced to
Well,
remain in.
well, let me ask you about that. Like, why the need for the transparently absurd number in terms of like election turnout, and then of course the 98% of the 87% that turned out magically voted for the incumbent?
So repressing people is very costly, Mark, as you can imagine. It's costly not just in the human lives that are being lost, but it's also costly for the geopolitical situation that Tanzania has always kind of argued as being an island of stability around fairly violent neighbors or who are experiencing violence themselves. And so they also understand that they need legitimacy, right? And so even if they were banking on the idea that there would be no demonstration, that there'd be no protest, that these planned protests would not happen. And so they needed to make sure that not only are they going to convince the public that there was high voter turnout, that she has legitimacy, that she won with this high percentage. Now, of course, as I said, the only other time where we are seeing the close to high turnout as they're claiming is in the 1980 elections, where 85% of voters are claimed to have turned out to vote in that election. And remember, in that election, there was no choice for the voter in terms of platforms. It was one party, and all you had to choose was between two candidates fielded by the same party. And they're claiming that they did slightly better in turnout than that election.
I guess, I mean, I need to give some credit to the ruling party, obviously, for having been in power for so long. But if the reason that they are claiming these absurd figures is to demonstrate legitimacy, I mean, to me, it seems that it would have the opposite effect, right? Like, if you're claiming you won 98% of the vote with 87% turnout, everyone knows those numbers are cooked. It would seem, at least to me, to delegitimize your victory in the eyes of most voters.
So there is scholarship, Mark, on this, and the Mexican political scientist Alberto Simser has work in this area, where like Tanzania, Mexico once had a very dominant party that had ruled Mexico over several decades, the PRI. And the insights that Alberto brings to bear come from his personal experience as a Mexican national, in that experience. And so one of the things that he claims in his work is an autocratic regime like the one that has just been sworn into power in Tanzania, that has ruled for decades, is using this absurd result, knowing fully well that people will know it's absurd, but as a way to kind of limit the abilities of people to overcome the collective action constraints to protest
Mhm.
again in the future. So you're showing people we have the power of the elites, we have the power of the army, we have the power of the police, and we're willing to use it as they have shown in the last few days. And we're willing to tell you something very absurd to show you, to kind of discourage future opposition. And so
Mhm.
one of the things that Alberto makes in his work, in his research, is that it's a way to kind of discourage and really make it very unlikely that the masses will
Mhm.
will then overcome these really massive collective action constraints. And you see the regime trying to do so. They had shut down the internet. Even this morning, I was unable to talk to some of my relatives in Tanzania on WhatsApp. So they're shutting it off and shutting it on,
Yeah,
especially as video footage is now being posted online of dead bodies, of other killings. They're starting to shut the internet and restrict calls, especially international calls, for certain areas in
and
Tanzania. And so this is exactly part of the playbook of an autocrat. You signal that you're a ridiculous percentage, to signal to your opponents that this is how powerful I am. I can
fascinating.
put forward such a lie and back it up with the monopoly of violence that I enjoy.
It's a flex, and honestly, this is why I love talking to political scientists like yourself for in conversations like this. You bring that broader context. Thank you for that. That was a fascinating answer. I didn't realize that. Um, you mentioned earlier, the presence of really widespread protests, but also that such protests are uncommon in Tanzania, despite it being a one-party state and frankly an authoritarian place for quite a while. Before we discuss what we know about what happened in this latest protests, why was it and why has it been that there hasn't been as much of, say, a culture of protest in Tanzania, at least compared to other countries in the region? I was talking to a Kenyan journalist last week as these protests in Tanzania were erupting, and she was like shocked and surprised. She's like, "Oh my gosh, even in Tanzania, they're rising up. We would never have expected to see this."
Right. I mean, so this is the running meme right now is, you'd have to be super evil to eventually induce Tanzanians to protest against you, and this is exactly right. The critical thing I suspect, Mark, is the elites in Tanzania are still united around the ruling party. On the first day of the protest on Wednesday, past Wednesday, October 29th, which was the day of the election. Now, remember, this was the date that was chosen by the planners of the protests to do so. When you think about scholarship on overcoming collective action, this idea of focal points is really important. So, in order for protests to be successful, there needs to be a significant amount of people to break a threshold to come out on the streets to encourage other people who would be more nervous to go up on the streets. That threshold has been very difficult for Tanzanians to hit for various reasons. For instance, a few years ago in 2017, the current major ruling party, opposition party leader, Tundu Lissu, who is a lawyer, a former member of parliament, who is currently in jail facing treason charges, and did not participate in the election. Neither did the second largest opposition party, which was wanted to participate, but were ruled in court as being inadmissible to participate. When this leading opposition leader, who is now in jail, Tundu Lissu, was shot, there was an attempted assassination, several bullets as he was heading home from parliamentary sessions in 2017, in September 2017. I thought personally, as a Tanzanian, as a political scientist, and I was in Tanzania at the time, that this would be the focal point that would allow for national protest. That was not enough for Tanzanians to do so. We've had election rigging since the reintroduction of multi-party democracy in 1995. There were protests then that were not as widespread as these recent ones. Those were immediately crushed in Dar es Salaam very violently. There have been protests in the elections in the Isles in Zanzibar that have also been periodically crushed very violently. And so there's been various moments where I thought this was the focal point that would bring people to the streets. But it seems like, Madam President, and excluding the opposition for the first time in multi-party elections in Tanzania since it was reintroduced in 1905, where you didn't have two of the major opposition parties being fielded in the presidential race. And so that I think is unique, and that could explain partly why the protests were successful this time around. The reason Kenyans were able to, for example, overcome these collective action constraints is because of the splintering of the elites themselves. The Tanzanian elites are still backing the presidency. On Wednesday, as I said, the army came out, or certain members of the army with armed vehicles came out on the streets of Dar es Salaam, at least. We have video evidence to corroborate this, encouraging protesters to exercise their constitutional right to protest, and protecting these protesters. So if we collect good data on the deaths, for example, we are likely to see very little or no deaths on that first day. And because of the protection of the army, with these images and videos of army officers in armored vehicles protecting protesters and urging the police to stop firing at protesters, this encouraged more people to show up on the second day. And so the second and third day, as the momentum looked like it was on the protester side, there seems to have been a backroom deal among the elites, because on that second day at night, we finally get to hear from the head of the army, the chief of the defense forces is the title that he gets, the CDF, reading clearly from a teleprompter, remarking that there will be, that there are criminal elements. This is the language that they're using, that this is not a protest, asking criminal elements to stop destroying property. Importantly, in that speech, in those remarks, he does not urge protesters to stop protesting. So protesters still continue to show up. What he was urging is no destruction of property. On the first and second days, protesters were targeting properties of famous politicians, famous individuals, including artists, both musical artists, theatrical artists, who were solidly on the side of the ruling party, who had posted leading up to that day that they still support Madam President. And so there were destructions of property, including the president's son's assets, including the children of various politicians. And so that was what the army was saying in that second night, that there needs to be no destruction of property. Some of the other advocates who were encouraging protesters, including Mange Kimambi, who is Tanzanian in the diaspora who lives right up the highway from me in California, um, um, continued to break to inform the public in Tanzania through social media that the army was fully behind these protests, and it looked very likely that it was going to be a coup d'état. But on the third and fourth day, the momentum quickly shifted, where you had armed men, masked armed men, in unmarked vehicles shooting directly at protesters. And then that's where you started to see the army start to retreat, and the army really now looking more solidly as part of the agents of the state. So that is really what is also
Hmm.
critical in this current situation to explain why these protests were successful. It was really because the army had been signaling leading up to the election, including a gentleman by the name of Captain Tesha, who is personnel in the Tanzanian Air Force, urging Tanzanians to exercise their freedoms of speech, their freedoms of assembly, their freedoms to express their conscience. And then, of course, on that first day, seeing army personnel getting cheered by the protesters and visibly protecting protesters so that the police officers started retreating. We also have video footage of protesters attacking police officers, suggesting, that at that moment, the police infrastructure had lost
Hmm.
abilities to use violence against its citizens.
Yeah, but nonetheless, as you said, there was a decision made for the army to switch stances and be less permissive of the protests, and in fact, start to use force against the protesters. And I suppose we don't know if those were army elements or other elements of the security forces, but the
So
fact
it,
is
it
that
seems
many.
it
Sorry,
seems
go
quite
ahead.
obvious, Mark, that there was not army personnel that was shooting at protesters. There is clear evidence from the video that I have reviewed, plenty of videos online. It was police officers and national security agents, unmarked national security agents, who were involved in shooting the personnel. The relatives and the few friends that I've spoken with, both during the protest and after, have talked about how the kindest personnel on the streets today are army personnel, not police officer personnel.
I mean, so does that suggest to you a potential rift in the elites? I mean, earlier you said that the reason that this party has been able to maintain power for so long was that there was no split among the elites. But you're suggesting to me now that the army may not be as solidly behind Madam President as other elements of the security forces.
So, typically, as you know, Mark, coups are not enacted by the most senior elites in the armies of any country. It is typically mid-level officers, captains, like this Captain Tesha in the Air Force, who typically successfully attempt coups. This is very similar. Tanzania is not unique. It suggests that there is a battle at the higher echelon of the army, and I think that's where there's a higher probability of state capture. But the middle level army personnel seem to not be completely as united as the senior level.
Mhm.
One of the claims and one of the galvanizing and organizing incentives of the protesters was this mainland versus island cleavage in Tanzania. As you know, Tanzania is a union between the mainland and the semi-autonomous islands called Zanzibar. Madam President is only the second out of six presidents of Tanzania to come from Zanzibar. She's obviously a woman, a Muslim woman. And I think all of these were being used and co opted by organizers of the protests to kind of encourage protesters in the mainland to protest, arguing that Madam President had stacked Zanzibari loyalists in the army. At the senior level, including allegedly this chief of staff, who is right underneath the chief of defense forces and who actually organizes logistics for the army, is a Zanzibari individual, and that there are various other loyalists from Zanzibar within the army. And so, and I have scholarship on this, Mark, that shows that a leader like Madam President, as an ethnic minority, as a woman, she's a minority leader in many dimensions, tend to more likely survive coup attempts in Africa than a majority leader, precisely because of this mechanism that I argue in my paper, that they're more strategic about placing loyalists in positions that are not very visible but are consequential in organizing a coup, for example. So they
Yeah,
coup
it's
their armies and their when they're dishing out patronage in
mhm.
ministerial positions. And as I show in that data, even though minority presidents and majority presidents are face the same level of coup risk, about the same equal amount, around 8%. Coup risk. Minority leaders are much more likely, more than two times more likely, to survive those coups. It looks like Madam President is going to be another classic example of these theoretical mechanisms I argue in that paper. And so
Yeah,
that,
that's
I
no, that's
think,
fascinating. And it's also maybe worth noting that, she came to office upon the death of her predecessor in 2021. So she was able to orchestrate this coup proofing, as you call it, is called in like political science literature, just in over the last 4 years by installing loyalists in kind of key positions that are not visible, but are nonetheless like consequential and be able to like, balance security forces against each other.
right. I mean, the
Yeah.
other claims being made, Mark, by the organizers of these protests, and I haven't fact checked this, so viewers should take this with a huge grain of salt. Um, is that among the six presidents of Tanzania, since our first president Nyerere to Madam President today, number six, only one other president is still alive, former president, and that is President Jakaya Kikwete, who won two terms in office from 2005 to 2015. Presidential terms in Tanzania are 5 years each. And the first time he won by a huge percentage, 80%. Actually, outside of the one party regimes, this is the highest percentage of multi party democratic elections since 1962, where we also have an incumbent who won more than 80% of the vote. And that president seems to be solidly aligned with Madam President. He's a ruling party, longtime ruling party insider. Even during the inauguration, he's seen smiling and kind of fist bumping the president. And the organizers of the protesters are claiming that the coup proofing was really at the advice of this former president. Even though he is not Zanzibari himself, he is one of the very senior Muslim elites in Tanzania. He comes from the coastal region north of Dar es Salaam, which is where the protests were the strongest. And so it suggests that she has an ally in this former
Mhm.
president, and the other side do not have an ally in a former president, because those allies, those former presidents, have now died, and so there isn't a kind of opposing force within the ruling faction.
Um, so can I ask, and I understand that it's kind of difficult to get information from Tanzania at the moment because of like intermittent internet blockages. But what do we know thus far about the scale of the violence directed against the protesters? There's been like, I've seen wide range of numbers of people killed, anywhere from like, hundreds to thousands. Like, what do we know about what actually transpired over the last couple of weeks?
It is unlikely, Mark, that we will ever know the true number of deaths in Tanzania following this. What is very likely to be true is that at least 1,000 individuals have lost their lives from these protests. There are videos showing an unarmed protester in the middle of the street, not throwing any rock, just standing there, ha- having what it looks like a verbal altercation with two or three visible police officers in a distance that is maybe no larger than maybe 10 feet away. And they shoot him. And you see his body slump over. And the protesters who are video recording this are even at another maybe 12 feet from that individual. And you can hear them in Kiswahili saying, "I think they shot him. I think they shot him." The body doesn't move, but it slumps over, and then you hear more gunshots, and the body falls to the ground. He's the only individual on the road. There are many videos such as these, Mark, where unarmed protesters were directly shot with live bullets, either by masked male assailants or uniformed police officers. We have a video of a protester being loaded into a police vehicle after being shot, and he's bleeding in the police vehicle. And the police, one police officer who's not uniformed, an ununiformed security personnel, stomping on his head, as this young man is obviously dying, as he's being as he's having his head stomped on, after being shot. So we have plenty of video evidence, corroborating the location, the dates, of these atrocities. And as somebody who knows a lot of these cities, you can clearly see that this is Dar es Salaam, this is Arusha, and so on. It's going to be very difficult. There's some accusations now that the government is rounding up bodies that were on the streets, and we don't know whether they're going to bury them in mass graves. Are they going to help identify family relatives? There is now efforts by activists to have a recording of missing individuals, so asking family members who have not been able to contact their relatives. The gentleman who stays in our home in Dar es Salaam, because my family now lives in California, told me, for instance, he had not been able to reach one of his uncles since Wednesday, and that he was asking for my advice on whether he should move out to go and find him. Now, of course, the city is now come, much more calm, and people have gone back to work. And so I told him I think it's now safe to go and look for your uncle. And I'm waiting to hear back from him later this evening, whether he was able to find his uncle safe. I also have one of my in-laws, a young man who was also shot. He was involved in the protest. My wife's nephew, but and thankfully he did not pass away. So far, I don't have any close relatives or friends. But it's likely that when we look back at looking at, for example, mortality data around this week, and comparing it to a similar week last year, I'm almost certain that you'll see the evidence that there was more than 1,000 people nationally who've died.
Do you think that the violence meted out by the government at this point has successfully crushed the protest movement?
It has definitely successfully crushed this episode. I think it's going to be very difficult for the protest movement to find another focal point. The election day was really the most powerful focal point that they could find. Ever since I've been young, and witnessed the first multi-party elections in my lifetime in 1995, there's never been a very great focal point as I've seen this past Wednesday. Now, of course, there's been other election days, but for some reason, people did not successfully come out for those protests. I think the straw that broke the camel's back was the prosecution that still continues of Tundu Lissu, the leading opposition leader, who is still in jail, and we are unsure about his own safety. And unsure how that court case will resolve. We are having hints based on the president's speech after being inaugurated that she wants to start dialogue with the other side, because she spoke about that. She urged Tanzanians to protect our stability, our unity, and that rather than destroying our country, that there should be dialogue. There is precedence on such things in Zanzibar, where the opposition has repeatedly been oppressed. There was a dialogue with a former opposition leader there who's now passed on, unrelated to electoral violence, where there was a unified government that involved him being given the deputy presidency of the islands. We have precedents in Kenya, where after electoral violence in 2007 and beyond, we had the opposition being invited to join the government in a unified kind of power sharing agreement. That suggests that the ruling party is hoping that that would be the deal that the other side would be satisfied with. Now, it looks likely that the elites on the opposition may want to do this deal, but it's unlikely that the rank and file members of the opposition, of the protest movements, will see that as a positive move. I think the worst thing for the ruling party is the opposition refusing to dialogue until electoral reforms are instituted, which is what they've been pushing for. This is why the main opposition party did not field a parliamentary candidate or for the district council elections. Because, the electoral commission is called an independent national electoral commission, but it is independent only in name, not in practice.
Mhm.
The head of the commission and the commissioners are appointed by the presidency. And as you can see, they've just declared her the winner with 98%, claiming 87% turnout. Just ridiculous numbers. And so it's unlikely that they will get full dialogue unless you have some international actors coming in to try and broker some sort of agreement.
Do you have a couple more minutes? I don't want to keep you from teaching a class or anything.
Sure.
Um, so, I, so to what extent do you fit the protests and what's happening in Tanzania today in like the larger context of the so-called Gen Z protests that we're seeing in other countries in the region, including Kenya, including Madagascar, where recently the protesters and the army did, collude in ways that did not turn out in Tanzania. You had this, youth-led protest movement in Madagascar, and eventually key army units, key military units, took their cue and did the coup, and that, toppled the government in Madagascar. That's not what happened in Tanzania. You're saying it might have happened. There was a potential it could happen, but it didn't happen. So I'm curious, do you fit like the current protests in Tanzania in kind of the broader context of this Gen Z protest movement we're seeing throughout Africa?
Absolutely. So, as you know, the majority of Tanzanians are very young. The median age in East Africa is basically 19, 20. I think Ugandans are even younger. At 17 is the median age of a Ugandan. So it's a fairly young population, and they're going to be as consequential as the boomers have been in the United States, for instance, just because of the sheer numbers as a proportion. Now, as the boomers here in the United States and the boomers in Tanzania, they're still the most consequential generation. They have the most economic power. They are still holding on to political power. So you're still, I would definitely characterize them within that broader Gen Z protest. I think what is critically different that led to the failure of this movement, at least if you were to consider them a failure up until this point, and I'm not necessarily ready to do so, is that the ruling party is using propaganda to claim that the genesis of these protests are from the diaspora. And beyond that, they've already started to use language, both by the president when she was inaugurated, but we've started to hear from the regional commissioners who are kind of like the governors of these regions, the subnational regions, including the regional commissioner for Dar es Salaam, where the protests were the most intense, that they're claiming that the protesters were not Tanzanians, that they were coming from neighboring countries, right? To try and dispel the idea that it was Tanzanians who were fed up with the ruling party, right? And so I think the fact that like most of the activists who were pushing for these protests were not based in Tanzania, including this woman activist, Mange Kimambi, who's in California, Maria Tsehai Sarungi, who's self-exiled in Kenya. We have various opposition party leaders who were also abroad during the election protest. And so the ruling party uses this against that movement by asking these young men and women, why are you risking your life for a movement whose leaders are not in Tanzania, who are unlikely to be risking their own lives for this movement, right? And so,
Yeah.
and you're going to start to see a lot more of that narrative being pushed, and you're already starting to see that threats to us Tanzanians in the diaspora as being targeted. So there's talks of freezing bank accounts and kind of blocking people's assets who are outside of Tanzania. And so this is exactly the kind of playbook of an autocrat to try and get rid of and splinter these opposition groups by claiming that their leadership is not actually risking their lives in the same way.
So, lastly, you just noted that you're not sure that this protest movement has failed just yet. In the coming days or weeks, what will you be looking towards? It'll suggest to you whether or not this momentum can be sustained.
So we're going to be looking at government officials who are not elected in government. How are they going to be co-opted into the new regime? How are they going to protest? And Tanzanians are famous for protesting silently, right, by dragging their feet as bureaucrats. But also, more importantly, the Electoral Commission has not released the parliamentary and district councillor results. They had said that the ruling party has won 172 out of the 174 seats in parliament, another 98% win. And so it'll be important for seeing how this movement reacts to the new government, because Tanzanians, the president only gets 10 appointments, because in order for you to be a minister, you need to be a member of parliament, both the minister and deputy minister. So in forming her new government, there are only two members of that government already formed, herself and the vice president. We don't know who the ministers are yet. We don't know who has been announced as winners in these races in the parliament. We're going to assume basically the ruling party is going to have a 98% majority in parliament. But from that parliamentary pool is where we're going to get the next cabinet. So who is being selected in that cabinet and how that movement reacts and the wider public reacts to the appointment of certain individuals to that cabinet is going to really be another focal point that I suspect may be a harbinger for worse things for the regime.
Well, Constantine, thank you so much for your time. Honestly, I really appreciated how you brought your obviously deep local knowledge with your extensive training as a political scientist to this conversation. Thank you. This was great.
Thank you, Mark. And yeah, the only thing I would say to your viewers and readers is the geopolitical realm is very important to the Tanzanian regime. And so, whatever support other activist movements around the world, whatever pressure the United States, the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, all these institutions matter for the situations on the ground in Tanzania. And if there are champions of democracy, this is the time to really join forces with the movement in Tanzania, because the alternative is that these people will feel emboldened to continue murdering young men and women who are exercising their constitutional rights.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.